hope everybody's taking care of that. We're going to pick up this morning with verse 24. We're going to really not spend much more time in chapter 14. We have done most of the hard lifting, the heavy lifting of it last week. But before we proceed, I do want to go back to one verse that I forgot to make a point on, and I think it's an interesting point. Go back to verse 21. Let's read it again, and let's get the point here. You shall not eat anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who's within your gates, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you're a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not boil the young goat in its mother's milk. Now that last sentence is not my emphasis here. But if you read that, the first part of that verse, it sounds to me like the Jews couldn't eat roadkill. Right? Couldn't eat roadkill. But they could give it to a foreigner, or they could sell it to a foreigner. But because of its impure nature in the way that it died, Jews couldn't eat roadkill. Blood wasn't drained out of it. Exactly right. And but again, they could make a shekel or two by selling it to a foreigner. Maybe so if it's diseased. If it's diseased, but when I read that, I found that really interesting and it just kind of popped in my head. It sounds like the Jews couldn't eat roadkill, and that is the case. And again, the impure nature of it, in the way that it died, it wasn't slaughtered in the proper way. That's why they could not partake of it. But again, the instructions are given here by Moses as to how they can get rid of it, either by giving it away or selling it. But I thought that was an interesting point, and I forgot to make it last Lord's Day. But you find some interesting things here in these dietary laws as we move along. As we mentioned, we're going to pick up with verse 24, but we need to stop and have a word of prayer before we proceed. Kevin, would you pray for us, please?
Heavenly Father, we come before you this Lord today, thanking you for the opportunity to be here, to study your word, and we ask the blessing to be upon each class that is represented, and be with the teachers as they bring forth their lesson. We pray for the sick, and those who are unable to be here, that your healing hand might touch them. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. Well, let's look at verses 24 through 27, and we will comment on them. But if the journey is too long for you so that you're not able to carry the tithe, of course, we picked up with tithing last week. Matter of fact, let's go back to verse 22, and then we'll move on. You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year, and you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil, of the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Now we get into verse 24. But if the journey is too long for you so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink, for whatever your heart desires you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. You shall not forsake the Levite who's within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. So, the Lord's going to choose a special place for these people to gather and to partake of this tithe that he has instructed them to hold back, this tenth. So whenever he chooses this special place, where it might be, some Israelites, of course, would be closer than others. And instruction is given here on how they were to handle things. Some of these Israelites would live a long way from the site. It's not like they could hop in the car and make a quick trip. We're talking days where they might have to travel. Yet they're instructed to go there. They can't avoid this when they have these feasts. It might not be practical for them, though, because of this long journey to carry these animals that they're instructed to take. And God provides a practical way for them to handle this situation. He says that you take the tithe among these animals. You do it the right way. You make sure that they're the best, that they're unspotted. But what you do is you sell them, and you take the money in your hand, and you take it to this special place, this designated place for feasting and for gathering for the people of God. And there you buy the food and the drink that you need. And in fact, he gives them much leeway in this. He says that you buy whatever your heart desires, and he mentions oxen or sheep, wine or similar drink, whatever your heart desires, because they have obeyed, hopefully they have obeyed the tithing situation when they sold what they had set aside. They had satisfied God's command at that time. So they take the money and they buy what they need. The tithing has been done. And then the family would feast in the designated place. Again, God is requiring to go to this place. And they can feast there, but not necessarily with what they had tithed. They've handled that earlier. Now, who else is included in this meal? God tells them and has told them before, don't forget the Levites. Don't forget the Levites. They don't have the flocks, the herds, and their job is, of course, to serve the Lord, to handle the worship, to handle the sacrifice, to assist the priesthood. Of course, the priesthood comes from the Levites. So they don't have a portion. They don't have flocks. They don't have places to grow crops. They depend on their Jewish brethren in the 11 other tribes to provide for them. So God, once again, through Moses, is telling them, don't forsake the Levites within the gates. And, of course, he's really talking about within the gates of the area of worship, because that is where they do their job. They don't have an inheritance with you. They didn't have land. They didn't have a spot of land. They were dependent on their brethren. So God very clear on how to handle this. And this is a practical thing here. God is not being unreasonable on what he's asking. He's asking them to tithe. This is a common thing for them. But if the journey's too long, it's not practical to drag those animals along, apparently. So a practical replacement is given here.
Did they manage to corrupt that later on?
Of course. They always did. But they did. But this is clear instruction. And again, it's wise. It's practical. But they couldn't live up to it, as David mentioned, as we have studied on and on, as the worship was corrupted, the practice of the religion was corrupted over the years, as they intermarried, as they brought in the idolic practices. And
wouldn't this have been even part of the problem when Jesus drew them out of the money changers out of the temple? Would this kind of be similar to that?
you know,
Wouldn't this be about the same thing?
it would seem that way, because that's to me, the only reason why that those people were stationed there and had set up camp there. And
That's what the money changers did.
that's what they were.
Sacrifice stuff at the temple.
And of course, those guys were actually accused of being unfair in the way that they dealt with even their Jewish brethren. They were looking to make a shekel or two, and they weren't being proper in the way that they had. That's no reason why God was angry, and certainly why Jesus showed such anger in that portion of the New Testament with these people. They'd corrupted God's law, and they'd corrupted these practical commands that had been given 1,000 years before.
Also, I think a lot of people today need to realize that this law is not universal. This is strictly for the Jews.
Just for the Jews.
Tithing, the sacrifices, the Sabbath days, all this stuff was given to the Jews.
Yep.
And that all ended on Calvary.
That's right.
You know, people today still think they got to observe the Sabbath. You got to have your tithing in.
Yeah.
You don't have that today.
Yeah. How many times when you turn on a television or turn a radio on and you hear a denominational preacher talk about tithing? It's not in the New Testament, guys. It's not. No, get off of it. It's not there. And of course, they like to call it the Christian Sabbath. It's not the Christian Sabbath because that's a corruption of the term.
Ben Carson, he once made a statement, the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath was never done away with. He still observes it today.
If he's Jewish, maybe he is.
He needs to read more about it.
He needs to read his Bible. That's exactly right. He needs to read his Bible. Any other comments? Well, verses 28 and 29, ending the chapter. At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates, they may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So another practical instruction here is given by God through Moses. Every 3 years, the Israelites actually share this tithe. They're going to not only hold it for themselves, as God had mentioned earlier, but now they are going to share the tithes. And what they're going to do, if you have a village situation, a town, they're going to come like to the town center, maybe a marketplace, if they had that in their community. And you're going to bring these tithes, and you're going to share them. You're going to share these tithes. The scripture specifically says that they're storing it up in this place, this maybe center of the town, this marketplace. You're storing up this for 3 people or 3 groups. What you're storing up, what you're collecting, gathering here, will go to, number 1, again, the Levites. Don't have a portion among the tribes of Israel. So they get some of this extra. Then it says, take care of the foreigner. Take care of the stranger among you. That's the stranger is the term used, but it means the foreigner. You take care of them. And then, of course, you take care of the poor. Some are not as blessed as others. Some need help. Some need food to survive for themselves and for their families. So the Levites, the foreigner, and the poor, they get to take from these things every 3rd year that are gathered in the community. Almost sounds like a food pantry that we would do today. But they were doing this every 3rd year, and this came from the tithe that was being gathered. So these people, these 3 groups we're talking about, would be able to eat from this storage. And because that they're taking care of these vulnerable groups, we're told that the Lord is going to bless them in all their work. That's basically how chapter 14 ends, that the Lord will bless you in all the work of your hand, which you do. Now the tribe of the Levites would have no territory. They have no place among the lands that are being taken or about to be taken, as we think about the contemporary setting of what we're reading here. They wouldn't have a tribal home. But they did, in the end, as we know from Numbers, get some possession as far as towns given to them. They would possess 48 towns in Israel. In other words, basically, you think about 4 for each tribe. And they would own land around these towns that they could eventually farm. And we read this in Numbers chapter 35, verses 1 through 9. Let's read what is written here by Moses. Chapter 35 of Numbers 1 through 9. And it reads, "And the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, saying, Command the children of Israel to give the Levites cities to dwell in from the inheritance of their possession, and you shall also give the Levites common land around the cities. They shall have the cities to dwell in, and their common land shall be for their cattle, for their herds, and for their animals." Again, provided by others. "The common land of the cities which you will give the Levites shall extend from the wall of the city outward 1,000 cubits all around, and you shall measure outside the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, on the south side 2,000 cubits, on the west side 2,000 cubits, and on the north side 2,000 cubits. The city shall be in the middle. This shall belong to them as common land for the cities. Now among the cities which you will give to the Levites, you shall appoint 6 cities of refuge to which a manslayer may flee, and to these you shall add 42 cities. So all the cities you will give to the Levites shall be 48. These you shall give with their common land, and the cities which you will give shall be from the possession of the children of Israel. From the larger tribe you shall give many, from the smaller you shall give few. Each shall give some of its cities to the Levites in proportion to the inheritance that each receives." So we see here in Numbers that they indeed have some things provided by their brethren. But if it wasn't for the generosity and the command to share, they'd have nothing. But we see from Numbers 35 that they do have some area to inhabit. They do have some cattle to deal with. And they would again receive these parts of these tithes and these offerings of the people in addition to what they could produce. But in the big scheme of things, despite what is being given to them, they didn't have much. They are basically wards of the nation. And what's given them, despite the number 48 and maybe the land around some cities, it wasn't much. And it probably was not enough to really sustain them. So in these instructions, God has a special place in his heart for these Levites who are doing his work and handling the spiritual matters of the nation as they get ready to move into the promised land. Take care of these people. These people are doing valuable work, and that's why that God indeed does take care of them and mention them so prominently as we end chapter 14. Any thoughts as we go into chapter 15? Would they have time? Yeah, exactly. They would. It's very doubtful that they could stop what they were divinely instructed to do and go out and tend a field or herd cattle and things like that. Their jobs were special. Their jobs were divinely appointed. And as long as they did them well, the nation did well. The nation prospered. As long as the Levites were properly handling the worship and the sacrifice. Well, let's begin with chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. We go into a whole new area here of study as far as how we're to deal with fellow man if we were a Jew at that time. Verses 1 through 3. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner you may require it, but you shall give up your claim to what is owed by your brother. So at the end of every 7th year, this is a call to cancel debts between the Jews, between Jewish brethren. At the end of this 7th year, no Israelite would owe a debt to another Israelite. It is gone. Cancel these debts. Take them off your books. Take them out of your mind. Don't go ask for payment at the end of this 7-year period. And Moses is telling us here in these words that this covers all of God's family, which of course were the children of Israel. Consider them all your family, despite what tribe you're in, despite what group you're in. This was a blanket command here. If they're a Jewish brother, Jewish sister, cancel those debts. They're your neighbors. They're your relatives. Because the Lord says He's canceling the debt. You cancel the debt. That is the command. A command from the Lord. Now, how do you deal with foreigners? We know here from the command, it was a different story. They did not fall under this every 7th year prohibition for collecting these debts. They didn't fall under this debt cancellation. The Israelites didn't need to cancel any debt that a foreigner owed to them. It's still on the books. However, they still cannot demand from another Israelite what he owed. This debt is closed. It's clear. Now, if an Israelite was able to pay the debt, he should pay it in this period that is not covered by this prohibition. Within that 7-year period. You owe something, you rightfully owe it, you pay it as best you are able to pay it. This is not saying just ignore your debts. Just kind of hold out to after that 7th year and you'll be okay. No. It's not what you say. It's still saying you pay for what you owe. Honor system. Yes.
You could borrow from somebody on the 6th year. 7th year would be clear.
It would be clear.
It'd be dishonest.
It would be dishonest. Yeah, that'd be kind of playing, I hate to use a gambling term, but that'd be playing the long game. And that would, you're right, would be very dishonest. And also it would be being a little bit looking for loopholes in God's law. And God, there are no loopholes in God's law. It is quite clear. But they must pay their proper debts, the debts they truly owe within that period. Now, this rule was really meant to help the poor. It was targeted toward the poor who could not pay. And really they were relying and living off the generosity of their brethren. Now, after some time, they may be able to pay the debt, and if they're in this period, they must do so. Don't hold back what is owed. Now, no law really goes into much detail saying they must, but as Kevin mentioned, this was an honor system. You know, do you want to be known as dishonest? Do you want to be known as basically cheating your brethren? No, you want to have a good reputation among others. And that's why that it was important that they maintain their honor and pay debts when debts were owed. Again, there were extreme situations where the poor needed some relief and needed some assistance. That's understandable. And the law covers this. And that's one reason why this 7-year rule was in place. It is God's mercy coming to the fore in the words of these 3 verses here. God's mercy is still here, but there's also responsibility that is in these words as well. When you have a debt to pay, pay it. Be as responsible, be as prompt as you can within that period until the prohibition comes into play. But again, God is still showing mercy here at the end of that 7-year period. Verses 4 through 6. Now, an exception here is given to this rule, except when there may be no poor among you, for the Lord will greatly bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe with care all of these commandments which I command you today. For the Lord your God will bless you just as he has promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you. So if the Israelites obey the Lord's commands, these verses say he is going to greatly bless you. There are going to be communities among you where there won't be any poor. Everyone's going to be so blessed, so abundant, and so abundantly provided for. You won't have this issue of this 7-year moratorium on debt collecting. You obey me, you serve me, you'll be blessed. And you're going to have this land that I have promised you. You will prosper in this land. And he'll cause the land to be productive for them. Area to graze cattle. Plenty of land to grow crops. He would increase their flocks. And as a nation, they would become wealthy. They're going to become rich. And they're going to look after each other if there is need. Not needing to necessarily put folks under debt, but each one would have proper provision. They would be cared for. There wouldn't be in some of these communities any poor people. That's a good thing. However, they still must be obeying the Lord's commands. Now, when the nation became wealthy, they're going to be able to lend to foreigners, it says here. Foreigners are going to come to you, and they're going to ask you, will you give me a loan? And we know that they're going to be so blessed, so provided for, that they could actually loan to these foreign peoples. And it's interesting that these wandering people in the wilderness are now going to be the power when they cross the Jordan. They're going to be the ones who are in charge, and they're going to be the ones who have the wealth. And these people who inherited the land originally, they're going to be impoverished. That shows you what God did to these people as Israel moved in. He made them rich at the expense of the people who were already there, the people who worshiped idols, the people who certainly were not serving him. There was a new sheriff in town, and it was the children of Israel in these different enclaves of the tribes. And they would become so wealthy as they served the Lord and were blessed that they could lend to other nations. This is a sense of the power that God was creating among these people. And they would obviously, as they take land, would rule over these foreigners to Israel. But, of course, the sad news that because of their sin, because of their disobedience, what is described here was temporary. It was really temporary. It didn't fully flower, did not fully develop as it should have. You know, we've talked about all the area that they were instructed to take. A wide swath of land, up into current Syria, up into current Lebanon, into what is now Iraq, Jordan, and of course what is now the state of Israel. It was a huge swath of land. They took about, when you look at the map, about 60% of it. When you think about how much land that they wasted, that God was going to give to them, they took about 60% of what God promised them. And it's sad to think that what could have developed. Now, on into the kingdom era, we know David and Solomon, because of conquest, did rule over foreign lands. But this was not the relationship that we're talking about here in these scriptures. Not the relationship that God originally intended, because Israel would not obey, Israel would not follow through on what God had told them was going to be the situation. And it's sad because you think about what their obedience would have produced. God promised them so much, and they didn't take it. They just didn't take it. Verses 7 and 8, probably that last we'll hit for this morning. If there is among you a poor man or of your brethren within any of the gates in your land, which the Lord your God's giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother. But you shall open your hand wide to him, and willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. Now, when they get power in the promised land, they're going to, certainly we discussed, going to be wealthy. They're going to be powerful, and they're going to have more than they need because of God's blessing of them as they are promised in the covenant. They serve God, they benefit. And each family would have a part of the land. But we're told here that after some time, there's going to be some poor among the wealthy, some poor people, some who do not benefit as much, are not as blessed as much for whatever reasons. We're not necessarily told among all this wealth and blessing why these folks are not as blessed. Maybe they're not as spiritual. Maybe they're not as industrious as others. But what is Israel told here? Don't look down on these people. They're told to be generous. The Israelites must be generous toward these poor Israelites. Don't be selfish, but share. Share with your brethren. And don't refuse to help these people. As I emphasized as I read here, on verse 8, he said, you open your hand to your brethren. Don't close it. Don't hide it. Whatever they need, you open your hand and your heart wide, and you share with your brothers. Be generous. Don't be selfish. Don't refuse to help your poor Israelite brethren. Lend to the poor whatever they need. If it's an industrious poor person, they'll pay you back. Although we know that provision is provided for them to forgive debt. But a good-hearted poor person will pay you back if you lend them. But this is both talking about lending and giving. Giving something that's free will. Something that is not necessarily where you're asking that it be returned.
You know, the Lord said it before, you'll have with you always.
That's right.
Even in the Israelite nation, you had
That's right. So basically they're told you either lend or you share with the poor what they need. And have the right attitude toward your poor brethren. Don't look down upon them. Don't belittle them. Don't abuse them. Because they're your brother. They're your sister. Accept them as if they were in your own family. Maybe they are in your own family. That could very well be the case. And be glad to do this. Don't look down or carp about it. But help these gladly. Be glad that you have the blessings of God that you can indeed share. It's so important. Let's hit one more verse and we'll be done for this morning. But beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you, and it become sin among you. So again, every 7 years you cancel these debts, as we have studied this morning. That was what Moses had taught them. Therefore, a loan late in this 7-year period, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about in this period, if we were on the clock, this would be like 11:30 at night. You're given a late loan. And this loan may be lost. So it turns it basically into a gift. And because of this, they might be stingy about sharing with their poor brothers. They might be stingy about lending because, I won't get it back. I won't be repaid. So I'm just not going to give them anything. This verse prohibits that. It says you still be a good brother. You still be a good sister. And you share. No matter the time of the year, the time of this debt cancellation. Don't have these, because these are wicked thoughts. This is sin. And this is a wicked attitude that would tear the nation apart. You be willing to lend, although you may not receive it back. You share. And to do otherwise would be sin. Now, an Israelite could refuse to lend to a poor person, and it says that the poor person could cry out to the Lord. And this is basically putting the person who refused to help on notice in the eyes of God. And in the eyes of God, a refusal to help was just simply sin. You don't want to be on God's books because of that, because you're not generous and you're not sharing. You share. Time is up. We will pick up with verse 10 and 11 next Lord's Day.